Hello, my name is Andy Smith, and I'm a candidate for the Minnesota House of Representatives. The essay I'm about to read to you is entitled, Why I Changed My Mind on Abortion. I hope it's helpful. What would you say to those who have made up their minds about abortion? The reporter asking the question was shivering, a byproduct of a wicked wind that brought an unnatural chill to the May morning. I had just given a short statement about my anger and fear that the Supreme Court might overturn Roe v. Wade, a potentiality at the time that has become law with the Dobbs v. Jackson decision a couple weeks ago. The reporter's question reflected the stagnation in America's abortion conversation. Many religious conservatives are steadfastly against abortion, and there was nothing that could change that. So the thinking goes. Perhaps because of the optimism of youth, I responded to that question. I would ask them to keep listening. If you had asked me 10 years ago, I would say my mind was made up about abortion, but now my views are completely different. 10 years ago, I was a fresh-faced 21-year-old who had just graduated from a fundamentalist college in Chicago, Moody Bible Institute, with a bachelor's in theology. I was on my way to seminary to become a pastor. I had no doubt that human life begins at conception, and abortion, even in the cases of rape, incest, or threat to the life of the mother, was murder and thus morally wrong. To my knowledge, I did not have a single close family member or friend who thought differently. My goal in this essay is to condense the thoughts, experiences, and difficulties that led me from that 21-year-old to my present-day self, a man running for office on a platform that includes expanding abortion care. Now, my reasons won't convince everyone, but they do show that change on this intense issue is possible. My shift started with the Supreme Court legalizing gay marriage. At the time, as a loyal evangelical Christian, I was against gay marriage just as much as I was against abortion. Wanting to address the landmark decision in a Bible study that I was teaching later in the week, I read the majority decision of Obergefell v. Hodges. I knew that I was going to disagree, and I would surely find flawed reasoning that led the justices to such an erroneous conclusion. However, as I read the opinion, I found myself agreeing with Justice Kennedy. If I truly believed that the 14th Amendment provided equal protection under the law, I had to extend its protections to same-sex marriage. Now, my changing opinions in the area of same-sex marriage, in short, I now happily celebrate it, is a topic for a whole other separate essay. But my experience with Obergefell drove me to read the most evil of all Supreme Court decisions, at least that's what I thought at the time, Roe v. Wade. I had deja vu, as I once again found myself agreeing with a majority opinion that I knew I shouldn't. Once again, the 14th Amendment defeated my held beliefs. The right to privacy, a conservative value if there ever was one, had to extend to one's own body and medical decisions. In a time where my conservative community was terrified over potential death panels with the passing of the Affordable Care Act, I was shocked that the same people wanted the government to make medical decisions for half the population. But even if the 14th Amendment said that abortion was acceptable, that didn't mean the Bible did, and as an evangelical Christian, the Bible was my ultimate authority. I believed that the Bible clearly condemned abortion in all circumstances. But once I started looking into it, I realized that the Bible actually doesn't say that much about abortion at all. The Hebrew Bible views life as beginning at first breath, the archetype being God's breathing the breath of life into lifeless earth to create Adam, the first creature made in the image of God. You'll find this in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, the Ten Commandments includes the prohibition against murder, but this law is specifically not applied to a fetus just one chapter later. Exodus 21 discusses a lot of different circumstances and penalties for accidental injuries because of a fight, including those to a pregnant woman. I assumed that the writer would be concerned about the unborn child, but actually the writer is most concerned with the safety of the woman. If the expectant mother has a miscarriage but is otherwise unharmed, the offender only has to pay a fine. But if the woman is injured, the offender is likewise injured or even killed. Any ambiguity in this passage is clarified later in the Torah in Numbers 5, where a forced miscarriage is required for children conceived out of wedlock. In other words, while the woman is given full personhood and protection under the law, an unborn fetus is not. As a young student, this passage rocked everything I thought I knew about abortion in the Bible. I grasped at other parts of the scripture. Didn't God say he knew the prophet Jeremiah from his mother's womb in Jeremiah 1:5? Well, yes, but as someone who already believed that God's omniscience is not restricted to time, this didn't really get me anywhere. Plus, the second half of the verse states pretty clearly that this is personal to Jeremiah. I couldn't claim that every unborn fetus was appointed to be a prophet to the nations. What about Psalm 135, where God says he knit me together in my mother's womb? Again, I couldn't get this verse to say anything about fetal personhood. It's a beautiful psalm, but it's about God's amazing creation. Quoting another part of the psalm, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. This psalm is about God's works, which includes my creation, but also a plant's photosynthesis or the light of a red dwarf star. And none of those were persons or made in God's image. The Bible wasn't very clear about abortion, and definitely not clear enough to support the stranglehold anti-abortion ideas have in the evangelical community. Around the same time, I was beginning to consider pregnancy in a more personal way. My wife Anna and I both came from large families, and we looked forward to starting one ourselves. We were delighted to become pregnant 5 months into trying, and we started planning how to surprise and tell our friends and family. But our dream turned pretty quickly into a nightmare when Anna began heavily spotting at 6 weeks. We scheduled an emergency doctor's appointment, and at the ultrasound, there was no baby. The pain of a miscarriage is unlike anything else I've ever experienced. Your grief isn't based on anything you lost, but on something you never had. But the doctor had more to tell us. He couldn't find an embryo on the ultrasound, but it might still be in Anna's fallopian tube. Something I learned was called an ectopic pregnancy. They had to check her HCG levels again later that week. If the levels were still rising, that meant the embryo was continuing to develop in the fallopian tube, but it couldn't survive there. It would eventually burst the fallopian tube and could lead to hemorrhaging and even death for Anna. If her HCG levels showed an ectopic pregnancy, Anna would take methotrexate, a drug used in abortions to kill the embryo. And if that didn't work, the embryo would grow too large. Laparoscopic surgery would be necessary to remove the embryo along with the fallopian tube. We were shocked to learn this. In order to save Anna's life, we might have to intentionally kill a living embryo. We had never even thought of that as an option for ourselves, but we also hadn't known about ectopic pregnancies. We went home and did a lot of research. We learned ectopic pregnancies are very common. In fact, ectopic pregnancies occur in 2% of all pregnancies. We learned that treatment for ectopic pregnancies often isn't considered an abortion, even though technically it is. It isn't called an abortion because doctors don't want to stigmatize essential life-saving care, and that fear is justified. We discovered that some Christians considered this treatment for ectopic pregnancy a sin. They argue that it is morally wrong to kill the living embryo, so people who find themselves in a situation with an ectopic pregnancy must wait and trust in God's will, even knowing that the embryo cannot survive and that the life of the woman, the person who is pregnant, is at great risk if that ectopic pregnancy continues. The simplistic slogans the church had taught us about abortion and the dearth of biological education in our evangelical upbringing had completely failed us. We felt very alone. But as we talked about our decision, it actually wasn't a hard decision to make. We disagreed with Christians who thought that abortion for ectopic pregnancy was a sin. Of course, we were devastated by the loss of the pregnancy, but we weren't going to allow an embryo that could not possibly survive to put Anna's life and health at risk. In the end, we didn't have to commit to any decision. Anna's HCG levels were going down, which meant that the embryo had already died and the miscarriage was proceeding normally. As we grieved the loss, we also struggled to incorporate this new information that abortion was not evil in all circumstances, but actually in many circumstances was life-saving care. We eventually tried again to start a family. After a year, we started the long and lonely road of fertility treatments. While I wish the agonies of infertility on no one, it does provide the best sex education available in our current society. I learned that naturally half of all embryos are lost during pregnancy, and that is just embryos that have already progressed beyond the initial blastocyst stage. Only 40% of blastocysts even make it to become embryos. Basically, if I believed that a soul conferred at conception, which is a standard abortion line that life begins at conception, I had to believe that billions and billions and billions of souls were created by God just to be destroyed within minutes, days, sometimes months of conception. And this just did not square with my belief in God and his love for humanity. Preparing for a potential pregnancy in my wife and the potential problems that could arise, I learned a whole lot more about childbirth. I had to absorb the reality of vaginal tearing. Pregnancy and childbirth permanently changes a woman's body and the neural network in her brain. Pregnancy can be an incapacitating experience, and, of course, childbirth itself is immensely painful, sometimes traumatizing, and comes with a myriad of potential complications and health risks. It's a good time to quote the minority dissent from Dobbs. There are few greater incursions on a body than forcing a woman to complete a pregnancy and give birth. For every woman, these experiences involve all manner of physical changes, medical treatments, including the possibility of cesarean section, and medical risk. That women happily undergo these burdens and hazards of their own accord does not lessen how far a state impinges on a woman's body when it compels her to bring a pregnancy to term. All of this led me to one solid and strong conclusion. I want no part of a law or a legal decision that forces a woman to give birth. Of course, important and life-changing medical decisions should be made only by the person who is pregnant. Of course, a pregnant person's privacy should be respected and constitutionally protected. Of course, states shouldn't try to legislate how doctors counsel their patients. Of course, such an important procedure should be widely available and affordable. The dominoes just kept falling as I considered this problem in the new light of these experiences and research. I suddenly had eyes to see the contempt for those who could become pregnant inherent in a lot of anti-abortion advocacy. Just as an example, Anna came home one day furious after hearing that the Ohio state legislature had tried to pass an abortion ban that required doctors to, quote, re-implement an ectopic pregnancy in the uterus, or they would be charged with murder. That procedure doesn't exist. We knew this personally. When faced with the possibility of an ectopic pregnancy, we desperately researched for treatment that would make the pregnancy viable. There is no such treatment. But the Ohio state legislature is so worried about killing embryos and legislating a woman's body that it made up a procedure while banning procedures that could save women's lives. Such ignorance and contempt for those who could become pregnant is abhorrent. It has been a long and painful journey for me, but I can now say that I am firmly a defender of abortion. When a person decides to have an abortion, that abortion should be safe, it should be legal, affordable, and easily accessible in their own communities. While once I would have rejoiced to see Roe overturned, I now stand with Justices Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan, and say, with sorrow for this court, but more for the many millions of American women who have lost today a fundamental constitutional protection, we dissent.